Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to be here today to introduce our webinar, Climate Action Required After COP29, a recap. Today's webinar will cover a short introduction to SGS, top 5 North American drivers, 6 big takeaways from COP29, 6 stages of climate action, 5 most regulated requirements, next steps, and Q&A. Please feel free to use the Q&A box on the left side of your screen to submit your questions. We will be distributing the slide deck, the recording, and links to the training to all attendees at the end of the presentation today. My name is Kim LaFrancois, and I am the ESG and Sustainability Business Development Manager for North America here at SGS. I've been in the testing, inspection, and certification industry for nearly 10 years, working with many different clients throughout various industries. The other speaker joining me today is Adam Hammis. Adam is the ESG Director here at SGS and has 20 years of experience as corporate ESG and sustainability consultant, author, and instructor. Adam has founded multiple organizations and has an MBA with international education and leadership experience integrating ESG, CSR, and sustainability into corporate strategy. He's also taken many different courses to become a competent and effective resource for ESG and sustainability.
So hi, everybody. I'm guessing you covered everything, Kim, so I'll jump in and say welcome to our webinar. SGS, if you don't know who we are the largest testing, inspection, and certification company in the world. We have a footprint all around the world, boots on the ground, literally in 2,600 offices, almost 100,000 employees. And sustainability has been embedded in what we do across the company from the top to the bottom for quite some time. It's one of our core principles. We've been sitting at the table for over 25 years at many of the working groups that are creating new standards for certification and verification, validation, and assurance, and then become often a preferred vendor to assure those. And we get recognized for our performance ourselves as a company by walking the walk. We're internationally acknowledged by all of the rating agencies. Because we're large and publicly traded, we have to be, but we do additional voluntary reporting for things like CDP and EcoVadis. And we were recently very proud to be named Time Magazine's 6th most sustainable company in the world. And so we do practice what we preach. Just to kick it off, today we're going to be talking about climate. Specifically what's happened after COP29. So just to get a good sense of where you are, because every company is not the same, to really get a sense of what works for you and what you should be focused on is just to get a sense of, have you completed a baseline greenhouse gas emissions inventory, or do you have a carbon footprint? It's one of the very first questions that's really important to know, and it tells us and you know where you are in that process. I would say yes, from SGS's standpoint. We've been doing this for quite some time. We're a CDP. We've been a leader on the A list. I think we're at A- and trying to work our way back up. But we feel that pain just like everybody else, is that the algorithms change and what you're required to do changes. So you have to stay on top of it and continue to grow and evolve your program, which we're doing. I think some of the things we're focused on, for instance, with CDP is setting our targets in our SBTs with SBTI to include our scope 3 emissions as well. So it's a never-ending journey. We're all on that journey together. If you're working on climate action and if you're interested, that's what you have to look forward to. I'll give it a few more seconds and then we'll see what everybody answered. So we got some yeses and nos and I'm not sure's. You're in good company. The first time you do it, it does take a lot of data collection. And so we can talk about that. And if you're not sure, ask around inside your company and find out. It's a great question to learn for your own business. So without further ado, let's talk about just North America. What's driving mostly today? We're going to talk about climate, but there's going to be some related issues. So I'll talk about greenhouse gas regulations in North America is really driven by a couple things. So Canada, and they sort of mirror each other, but Canada for a long time has had their national program, the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program for heavy emitters. There's also the B15 FRFI rules. That's the federally regulated financial institutions. So the larger banks that are federally regulated have regulations, and then federal suppliers in Canada of a certain size. But also IFRS the S1 and S2 standard. We'll talk about S2 in this one specifically, but those came out early last year. They've just been translated into what's now in Canada called CSDS, but try not to confuse people. But internationally, it's IFRS, and U.S. does not have that because the U.S. is one of the only developed worlds that still uses GAAP accounting. But the international financial reporting standards have a climate standard embedded in them now. And then to mirror that, USA, we have our own greenhouse gas reporting program for heavy emitters, heavy industry. The FDIC also has big bank guidance to the larger financial institutions in the US to manage climate risk within their portfolios. And then California has the SB 253 and 261 climate rules, which just got delayed one more year, but they are still in effect. And with the recent election and state election, everyone expects those to not go anywhere. So those will still be in effect. But then broader, because climate is often one of several material topics in broader sustainability regulations. Globally, what's pushing not only climate disclosure, but other disclosures is the European Union has both CSRD and the CSDDD. Those are basically double materiality assessments of what your material issues are, and then reporting on those. Climate is almost always included. And then IFRS S1, even if you're not in the European Union, if you're not in the United States, every other country, for the most part, is using IFRS, and they have general sustainability disclosures built in as well, just like CSDS in Canada. So regulation is at the top of the list. It's driving most reporting. And around climate, you'll also have number 2, which is public sustainability ratings. Now, this is coming from the top down because investors and creditors of the bigger companies, the publicly traded companies, they're making buy, sell, and lend decisions based on scores. And the most common prominent scores that are respected and still are around are the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, MSCI, ISS. They both have an ESG rating. And then Sustainalytics, which has the highest number of users. And Sustainalytics was not, as you can see, an extension of a previous financial reporting institution. Sustainalytics was born as a sustainability rating system and has continued to be very popular. So that has been influencing the publicly traded companies and the large brands. And then that leads into driver number 3, which is sustainable supply chain scores. And that means those big brands and the financial institutions that have the regulation, they're improving their own scores by requesting ESG data from either their suppliers, or if you're a bank, it's the lendees and clients to that financial institution, because managing your supply chain and your broader, often scope 3 emissions is something that you have to do in the realm of greenhouse gas accounting. So the platforms that are really driving things and continue to, although there are lots of platforms, that universally CDP, especially in climate, has a very large and growing user base. And they also have, and that's for disclosing specifically greenhouse gas climate risk data and emissions data, things if you're setting targets. But there's something called the supply chain membership, and 300 large companies have publicly signed up online. You can see all of them. You can go search who they are, and said we are going to manage our supply chain and our carbon footprint in our supply chain using the CDP platform. I'll mention here that it was actually regulatory based. They're the first time, but that has since expected to completely go away. But the previous Biden-Harris administration had the federal supplier rule that was going to go into effect had CDP listed by name, which was one of the first times, but it's starting to come up in actual regulation as a popular, universally accepted platform that aligns with global regulation standards and frameworks. But those 300 companies are pushing into their supply chain. And then EcoVadis is broader. It includes climate, but they have a very fast growing user base, 130,000 plus. And they're also signing up what's called sector initiatives. So you can go there's 12 sector initiatives that have multiple companies per sector, and they're identifying their material issues. Climate's almost always one of them. And those companies have publicly stated, we're going to use the EcoVadis platform to ask our suppliers to report their data, which again, often includes climate emission data. And then the last 2 are much smaller, but sometimes very relevant depending on your company. but consumers are obviously, in some sectors, not all consumers, but willing to pay more for health and sustainability. There's a subsection called low-cost consumers, lifestyles of health and sustainability, that is closely monitored. It's globally a $546 billion market. In the US, that's estimated at 23% of consumers, and it's growing at roughly 10% per year. And McKinsey's, their annual survey is even a little higher than that. They said 70% of consumers are willing to pay more for green products that perform as well, so price parity. And then 50% said that 50% of the companies surveyed said that their business growth is driving their sustainability initiatives, which read another way means they see the ability to sell new products and services by releasing and going into new markets for more responsible, socially or environmentally responsible products and services. So that's actually driving business growth for them, and that's why they're offering it. And then the last driver is employees. And again, it's often the higher level, not the hourly workers, but your skilled labor, and that winning the talent war for that skilled labor is becoming increasingly important. To have employees who care about and share your values and believe strongly in different various sustainability issues. The IBM's 2022 Institute for Business Value survey, which surveys 16,000 employees every year in 10 countries, said 67% were more willing to apply for and accept positions with sustainable companies. And again, that was according to the individuals who took the survey. So that can mean a lot of things. But 2020, a similar Unily survey of 2,000 UK-based office workers, they worded it slightly different, said they felt their employer was not doing enough. 83% and 65% said they would prefer working for a better company. So there is a drive out there to show, at least to your employees, that you're living your values and walking that walk when it comes to climate action. And so I just said a lot of things are 5 big drivers, but I'll repeat this over and over again. What matters is your organization, and specifically are you consumer facing? If not, then you don't really get affected by that. But what is your organization's #1 business driver for climate action? Because if you're large and publicly traded, it might just be for the rating, and those rating agencies are your main thing. It doesn't mean you don't have a second and a third. You might have a mix of all 5, but it's really important to know what your #1 is, because you have to build a strategy, and you cannot make everybody happy. You cannot do everything well at the same time. You do have to prioritize. And so knowing what your company is trying to accomplish is important. So I would say SGS, largely, I think it's baked into who we are. I would argue probably it could come from our, you wouldn't say consumers, but we would say supply chain customers / regulations / consumers. We have a really nice balance of everything because we're large and publicly traded. So we have ESG rating agencies, but we're always trying to demonstrate. We typically go above and beyond with sustainability because it's a good sales tool. We showcase that we know how to do these things so we can help your company do these things. But we are regulated, and we're in a lot of countries, so we have to follow regulations closely. We're not a consumer facing, so if you want to say customers, maybe. And our employees care pretty deeply about sustainability, or they wouldn't work for us. So we're an interesting one as a service organization, but I would say, you could select your #1, and I'll give you about 5 more seconds, and then we'll head on and see what the group said. So again, a very nice balance, accept employees. And I'm not surprised, but I would just suggest that keep those skilled positions in mind for people who have more opportunities, especially if I'm in a rural state of Iowa. It becomes very difficult to recruit people to a state. And we put a big focus on values and recruiting people because you have to have more reasons. There's no mountains, there's no ocean. You've got to have culture / community / fun things to do / something to make up for that. And sometimes your sustainability program is one piece of that puzzle. And then last, were you paying attention to the recent COP29 conference? Pretty simple one. Could be yes, could be no, it could be, what is COP29? I don't know what we're talking about. Be surprised a little bit because that's what the title of the webinar was. But, not everybody watches that closely, and it's been a busy year. There's an election year in the US. Everything gets crazy, inundated with ads and messages, but give everybody a few more seconds. This was a pretty easy quiz question. All right. So a lot of no's, a little bit of yeses, so I'm glad. So we'll see if we came up with the same info. So for those who did not know, COP29 is the United Nations Climate Change Conference of Parties. There are a lot of conference of parties. This is the climate change COP that we're referring to. There's 165 signatories to this particular UN FCCC, the Convention on Climate Change, and to this year it was held in November, or last year technically, this November 7th through the 22nd. It's in Baku, Azerbaijan. I probably said it wrong. And it changes every year. There's always a lot of criticism. There's a lot of hype and a lot of excitement, but there's always a lot of criticism, no matter where it's held. But some of these countries have questionable climate records, and so people get pretty vocal. So you would have noticed that on the news as well. But here's the key takeaways in the shortest form we could put it. So here's what happened. Climate finance was big. So they tripled the previous target from the developed nations to $300 billion. So they did increase it. So it was a big increase, but comparatively, they believe that there's $1.3 trillion required. So it came up far short. And it encourages voluntary investment from the developing world, which is trying to have fairness and equity from the countries that have the least amount of footprint when it comes to climate change, and the least amount of resources and GDP to make a difference. But it was a big 3% increase, but it's still comes up far short of what is believed to be needed. Carbon markets were established. There's a framework under the Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement. That was the original agreement long back in the day. And the Paris Agreement is basically 50% reduction by 2030, or net zero by 2050. But now we have the first framework established to regulate the international carbon credit trading market. And that's big because there's just always a lot of criticism and questioning. If we build market-based tools to make a difference, is it making a difference, or is it just pushing numbers around? And are people trusting that that system is doing what it says it's going to do? Integrity and trust in those systems, and knowing that they are actually removing carbon, capturing carbon, preventing and avoiding carbon in the atmosphere is critical. Otherwise, it won't be continued. Number 3 is adaptation and resilience. So there was an agreement to increase support for adaptation financing in the SIDS and LDC countries, and submitting these national annual plans by 2025. So the easy way of saying that is climate change is so overly and universally agreed to and accepted from a science standpoint that there's also an overwhelming belief that the existing impacts are here and now. And not only should we be investing in trying to prevent the worst, and this is usually the framing, we're trying to prevent the worst impacts of climate change, not avoid it altogether because it's already happening. But we have to be fair and adapt to some of the existing impacts that are here, especially for small countries, island nations. There's already a large amount of basically forced migration from low-lying countries that have very little impact and did not contribute to the problem. And so agreeing to have finance for those is important. And then last is more of what wasn't happened. The takeaways for the recap is it ignored this year's agreements that are actually written and signed onto, largely ignored industrial emissions. They acknowledged that reductions were needed in industries like steel, cement, and chemicals, very big drivers of climate change, but there were very few commitments in these areas. It also ignored electric vehicles. There were almost no discussions or agreements on reductions in transportation, despite road vehicles being about 15% of global energy-related emissions. And then it didn't ignore, but it delayed the energy transition. So we discussed, often these things are done and pushed, kick the can down the road, but they discussed renewable energy, especially like green hydrogen, but there were no actions or statements to phase out fossil fuels. And it was essentially deferred to next year, COP30, which will be in Belém, Brazil. And those are the big takeaways. The thing to know as an organization, what you can do with that is you really need to understand not only what we talked about earlier, but your drivers are essential, but they're driving what kind of action within your organization. And there's really 6 types of action, and they should be sequential. but it's really about training yourself, building competencies within your organization. If you don't understand climate change, climate science, and carbon accounting, it's really hard to do anything, because then you have to measure. Then you have to measure your carbon footprint. Most organizations are doing it at the organizational level, but there are product footprints, there are project footprints, they're all important. But if you don't know how to measure, set boundaries, collect the data, and do the calculations, you can't do the next step, which is verification. Make sure that your calculations and measurements were correct. At a minimum, internally, you have to do some sort of, like have your finance team, your auditing team that is not doing the calculations, review your math, check your calculations, check your emission factors, and then often you want external assurances. You can get what's called pre-verifications and pre-assurance. You can also have a full-on assurance that provides you a certificate or a statement of opinion, basically at a CPA level, and we do that. We're a third-party verifier. And then you can report, because it's really hard to, and you shouldn't report, because there are actually growing regulations to penalize folks if you report incorrect information, but you want to report after you've verified, and sometimes that's mandatory reporting that's expected at the national level, or it's voluntary. Either way, you should use adopted and accepted frameworks and standards for universally comparing apples to apples, so that everyone knows what the data means. And then once you have data to report, you can set improvement targets. Often those are public, but they can be private, they can be internal. But that goal setting is almost always today, by and large, following the SBTI model, which is the Science-Based Standards Institute, and they validate those to say, are you aligning with the Paris agreements, which is what scientists say is needed by 2050 to be net zero. And then doing the actual work, which should not be, there's always a lot of training, measurement, verification, reporting, and target setting. That should not take over the results of the information you're trying to gather. Is that do something, make actual reductions, absolute reductions in your operations. You can do offsets. In-setting is becoming more popular, is to actually invest in your supply chain, even if it's outside of your four walls, and to improve your Scope 3 emissions. But do make reductions, change and improve your operations, optimize your supply chain, substitute materials, substitute fuels, look at offsets as a short-term strategy, but it's not going to get us to 2050. And all of that is trying to drive number 6, which is reductions. So that's the work that there is to be done for any organization. And one thing to ask yourself is, you're probably going to be good at some of those things and have amazing skill sets that you can just repurpose, but you're not going to be good at everything, and nobody ever is. So ask yourself, what stage of climate action does your organization today find the most challenging? Are you just starting out and you really just need training to see what to do next? Do you really know, but you have maybe complex operations and you just aren't confident in your measurement? Have you done measurement for 10 years, but you've never been verified? I would warn against that, because then if you find out 10 years in that you have been miscalculating something, you have to go roll that back, or not use, and basically recalculate 10 years of data, or stop using that data and change your baseline, which then feels like you're wasting 10 years of really good data. And then reporting, how do you report to which organizations are relevant to your organization? Don't do them all. It's overwhelming. And then, are you setting targets? Are they aligned with the SBTI guidance and the Paris Treaty level reductions? Is there some other target setting that would be more applicable to your organization? And then reductions, which is huge. Are you just finding it difficult? You could go out and pay for some offsets. Most people find that easy. It can be expensive, but are you struggling to find reduction opportunities within your four walls, within your vehicles, within your assets, or even within your, which is bigger, your Scope 3 emissions in your supply chain? So I'll let everybody, I would say for us, we're really looking at targets and Scope 3 targets. So I'll just be, I'll tell you where we're at, trying to climb back up to CDP leader on the A list. And I'll give everybody about 5 more seconds, and then we'll go forward. All right. Nice balance. That's what's impressive, which I like, is that there's the least amount of struggle with reporting and targets. So that's great. Measurement is tricky. There's the greenhouse gas protocol, which has most of the guidance, has been around the longest, but ISO 14064-1, ISO 14064-2, ISO 14067. There's tons of great material out there. And then also just getting with industry-specific research organizations, maybe universities, your trade associations for your industry. You have to continue developing better and better details and qualified emission factors that are trusted in your space. So that's always really important when it comes to measurement when you get into Scope 3. So let's jump into something that's really important. What are the 5 most regulated greenhouse gas actions that you should definitely consider, because regulation is not only advancing, but continuing to advance? I will say that there are some that took a delay, but if you look at Europe, the US, for instance, was announced, I think, yesterday. The new President Trump just took office immediately, which everyone thought he was going to do. We've been taken out of the Paris agreement internationally. Everyone expected that to happen. It's not a surprise. So the US SEC regulation that was pending is probably also going to be gone. The US federal supplier rule is probably going to be gone. Like I said, the California rule will stand. So there's going to be progress, and it'll still continue. But the reality is we live in a world that is a global economy. Europe has much stronger regulation. They're always about 6 years ahead of us. South America, East Asia. So it's going to continue. And the international financial reporting standards have now embedded S1 and S2. So it's not going away. It just will go slower over the next 4 years. And then maybe something will change, but it will continue to go in advance. So here's the ones you need to know. Risk reporting, and specifically climate risk, and it's even before doing emissions calculations, but it was TCFD driven. Now it's very much IFRS, S2, and climate risk. SB 261 out of California is equivalent to this, but essentially it is 4 categories. You have to look at, do you have governance in place to manage climate risk? What's your strategy? How are you managing those risks? And what metrics and targets do you plan on setting given the risks that you've identified? It's very non-prescriptive, but it is 4 categorical disclosures that are required. And that's the number one globally. It's the most regulated, and now it's IFRS embedded, and it's also for any companies doing business in California, over $500 million in revenue. It's also embedded into those rules. That's number one. And just to know about TCFD, if you didn't, the integrated reporting, everything above the orange line here is the financial materiality. So it's just driven by investors for financial impacts to the company. The integrated reporting standards, the SASB standards, and TCFD all combined, and the Values Reporting Foundation was that entity. It since has absorbed into IFRS and was released last year as S1 and S2. So this is just the pure financial people saying investors want to know if you're managing climate risk. Then you have folks who are into GRI and impact materiality, like the UN Sustainable Development Goals. That's very much good for the planet. How is your organization impacting the world around you and the environment? But those are not necessarily being driven by the investor community. They just align and then go further and have additional KPIs. So that's where this climate risk came from. So TCFD essentially became a little more robust and got rolled out. And if you download these slides, you're going to be able to actually get those standards for yourself. To give you a little sneak peek, TCFD, like I said, was just governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. But S1 I mentioned earlier, is the general sustainability, but S2 is the climate-related disclosures specifically, and it's essentially TCFD with more. It makes sure you have integrated governance, so it goes a little further, has 4 subcategories under strategy that they want you to disclose about, and the metrics and targets give you 4 other categories that they want to see, including cross-industry metric categories that they spell out for you and say, here are the things we'd like to see. So It's quite easy to follow both TCFD and IFRS S2, and that's giving you a sense of what the reporting is. Here's a quick look at California, SB 253 and 261. Not going to go too far into it, but at 500 million in revenue, you have to do a climate risk report, and that's every other year, starting in 2027 for your 2026 data. And that's just a report that you have to make available online. But then if you're a $1 billion revenue company or above, you actually have to disclose first scope 1 and 2 emissions, report it to CARB, the California Area Resource Board, and get limited assurance. And then you add scope 3 later with no assurance in the following year, but by 2030, it'll be scope 1, 2, and 1 and 2 at reasonable assurance with scope 3 at limited assurance. So there's just a stair step giving people the ability to get comfortable. And there's 5,300 companies plus that are impacted at the highest level by SB 253. And there's over 10,000 companies impacted by SB 261 at the $500 million threshold. The max penalty is $500,000 per year for not disclosing, although they said if you disclose and it's not correct, that they're going to give you a pass the first year, because they just want people to get used to submitting. And then climate disclosure, that's the same. Oh, I think that's just a repeat. Okay, so that was climate risk. The reason I went into it, because it was the #1 regulated requirement globally, and it is here in both Canada based on CSDS and the IFRS S2, but also in the US by California SB 261. And then there's just greenhouse gas accounting. You have to report your emissions, scope 1 and 2, often sometimes scope 3. And the first place to start is you should look at the greenhouse gas protocol. Very few of the regulations are specifying ISO standards, although we highly recommend it, because GHG protocol does not have an assurance standard. It's just an accounting standard. So to get assurance, you really need to also have alignment with ISO, at least 14064-3, and your approach to verification. But you do really need to be familiar with the GHG protocol and how you do accounting for your emissions. And then next is verification. Not every company is going to have to verify, but we even recommend, especially your first year, to give your inner confidence that your team itself knows you're calculating correctly, because you're going to use this data for making business decisions, is that get a pre-verification. You don't even need a statement of opinion. It can be fully remote, but get a pre-verification, even if it's not fully at the limited level, and make sure that you have some confidence. ISO 14064-1 is the organizational footprint side, but like I mentioned earlier, ISO 14064-2 is if you have projects, especially for carbon offsets. And then if you are a product, like if you're selling a lot of individual products, then you might be needing an ISO 14067 product footprint, which is defined like per unit of product that you sell. All of those could be useful. Starting with the organizational footprint is the best, in our opinion, to get familiar with the accounting principles themselves. Sustainability assurance. So what is verification? So in the world of all of this, if you just look left to right, from strategy to readiness to assurance, it's really comes last. And we always joke, but it's true, like our sustainability assurance team are just the nerds who check people's work. We have a lot of industry experience. We have PhDs and masters of engineering, and we go out and check people's work that is very complex for multiple industries across multiple regions. And assurance is that check that you want at the end. Limited and reasonable assurance, it mirrors a CPA, how they would assure your financials. In fact, sustainability assurance in the financial sector is just simply called non-financial reporting and non-financial assurance. And that's why engineering firms and auditing firms like us are allowed to do it, where CPAs have to do your financials. But limited is what it sounds like. It's not as aggressive. It's not as robust. The sampling is not as high. The reasonable is at a very high level of sampling, and I'll show you an example here. But the tangible benefits to verification and assurance are just the internal confidence in your own investments and strategies, the external confidence of your customers and your stakeholders, and meeting regulatory requirements and improving your ESG ratings. All of those platforms we talked about before give you additional points and score increases for having verified data, not just voluntary, unverified data. So in the world of assurance, greenhouse gas is just called verification and validation. Organizational footprints, historical information is verification. If you're looking at your targets or what you're going to do, that's called validation. But it's really simple for the most part. Greenhouse gases, you have multiple scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and anything that is above 10% of your total emissions in that scope has to be sampled and get down to source evidence. So go look at invoices, work orders, purchase agreements, primary data from sensors, things like that. And there's going to be a lot of categories that might be very small percentages that don't fall under that, but the largest emission categories have to be sampled. And then reasonable is you drop that threshold down to 5%. So you're going to have far more categories that are going to have to be sampled down to source evidence. And then if you just do greenhouse gas protocol without an assurance standard, that's called an unaccredited service. There is no accreditation for greenhouse gas protocol. Like I said, that's not an assurance standard, it's an accounting standard. But if you move into the ISO standards, you can do accredited, and that's the entire world of like the highest levels of confidence, and some regulations require it and some investors and stakeholder groups require it. But you have to know what your drivers are, whether you go unaccredited or accredited. So I'll take a break really quick because I said a lot of things and we're getting close to the end. But what's the level of verification does your organization have in place for your greenhouse gas, either risk assessment or your emissions? It could be none, just an internal review with your finance team. It could be an external review it's unaccredited. It's just a consultant who gives it a once over. We often call those pre-verifications. But then there's limited assurance, or an accredited verifier, or an approved or qualified verifier, or last is, and the most rigorous, is reasonable assurance by a qualified verifier. And I will say ours are done, I believe, at the, boy, I should know this, but I believe our scope 1 and 2 are done at reasonable, and our scope 3 is done at limited assurance. And no pun intended, sometimes just the limited assurance is all that's possible, because you're very limited when it comes to scope 3 emissions. You're really relying a lot of estimates and off-the-shelf emission factors, and sometimes it's very difficult to say with any confidence that it could be reasonable because it is identical to what a CPA needs to say to be able to write that statement of opinion. So we are reasonable assurance at scope 1 and 2 with limited assurance at scope 3. Give it a couple more seconds. Let's see where everybody's at. So we've got some with none, some with internal. Thank you, internal review teams. I can't tell you how often I'm surprised that that doesn't happen. They feel like it's either nothing or get a consultant. And I say, hey, you've got a great team. You do it at least with your finance team. And then that could be your step 1. And last couple, regulated greenhouse gas targets. So there are plenty of programs that will actually require you not to only disclose, but to set targets. And often they just use SBTI as that target. Some of them encourage and often incentivize trying to get to carbon neutral standards and joining programs and making net zero commitments and things like that. But almost usually the requirements start at just get an SBTI approved or validated science-based target. And that is, like I mentioned before, absolute reductions, 50% reduction by 2030, net zero by 2050. And these are great standards to familiarize yourself with. And last, I put an asterisk because it was written into the US federal supplier rule as a regulated platform to use. We fully believe that's going away. If it hasn't already, it could be announced any minute. But CDP is still on the list because it's also has incredible uptick from the supply chain management side. It is difficult to manage large supply chains and emissions data, and CDP is one way that, like we mentioned earlier, these large brands are signing up to be supply chain members of CDP and publicly commit to requesting that their suppliers put their emissions data into CDP, and they get a score and they get tools for improvement It does provide a resource to these companies, but it is also a requirement. So it's on the list as the 5th one, but it is definitely has a big asterisk next to it. And just to back up and summarize everything. So how do you make climate action add value to you, especially after what we're seeing from COP29, what's coming in COP30? You have to know your business drivers. Don't pick all of them. Prioritize the top ones. Is it ESG ratings? Is it supply chain customer pressure? Is it regulatory, consumers, employees? And then what's your stage? Like, where are you at? Where do you need help? And just focus on making a couple improvements a year. You're not going to try to fix and be perfect at everything, but you've got to understand where your weaknesses are and strengthen your ability to move through those 6 stages year after year. And then which of these top 5 regulated actions are relevant to you. Climate risk reporting is top of the list, but it might not be. It depends on the size and region of your company. But is it accounting you should be focused on? Do you need verification? Are you required to set targets? And the CDP, are you getting large customers of yours sending you surveys saying, what's your greenhouse gas? Please report into CDP or EcoVadis. And those are the types of things that you should expect more and more of, because that is growing pretty rapidly. And so that's how you can approach it in a very high level summary. And I'll just say, what's your priority? So given all of that, are you focused on climate risk reporting? Are you focused on the accounting, just basically reporting your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions? Do you need verification? You haven't sought that in the past, and now you would need to. Have you just had trouble setting targets, or you've never been asked before? Or has someone sent you a CDP questionnaire and said, we need you to fill this out, otherwise, we might not do business with you? And it could be something else. I will say that up until recently, climate has been, especially in North America and the United States 5 years ago, largely voluntary, and the companies were just doing it because they were passionately interested in the topic, they were worried, and they were doing it. And there wasn't necessarily a strong regulatory or demand driver from a big customer. Voluntary has been around since the 90s, so that's not new. You could certainly have that. I would say for us, our current priority, like I said, is setting our target and having it cover the scope 3 emissions, which was more complex, and that it was taking us longer to get there, but we had SBTi validated targets for scope 1 and 2. All right, give it a few more seconds to see things coming in, and go. So here, other, I'd love to hear the others. You've got the Q&A question box. You could just type it in if you've got some other drivers. We'd love to hear it. But risk reporting is high and targets are high. That makes sense. And these are the things that are going to help us keep moving forward. The targets help really kind of hold your feet to the fire, but the risk reporting is often missing. And I think it's incredibly, incredibly important to do that climate risk, because it answers those questions for you in a more detailed way than just, hey, me showing you 5 drivers and you picking one. It's actually doing the deep dive into geographical risks, transition risks, financial risks, and modeling, and really helps your company also see. And there, Alicia says CSRD. So, yep, regulatory. I guess you could put that. It's not on here. But CSRD, much like I said at the very beginning, is a sustainability reporting directive that includes climate within it. And so it's driving not just climate disclosures, but other environmental and social disclosures as well. We have SGS Academy courses. This is where we offer our training on greenhouse gas. We're going to have the links down below. I think we actually have a 5-day course posted right now and a 4-day course. We're moving towards the 4-day course, but they are fantastic. Our lead verifiers design the course and teach them. We also have a Boost Your CDP Climate Score 4-hour technical workshop that helps people specifically on CDP. A lot of our stuff I've mentioned back here, some of the sustainability courses we have, like this one's a free 50-minute class we just put it on YouTube. We're trying to put more and more content. We have tons of interviews, client conversations, technical webinars, so much information, like over 100 hours, 100 videos, and growing every week. that if you go to our YouTube channel, SGS North America, you'll find something useful there, I promise you. We have a really amazing for large brands who have supply chain issues that they're trying to manage. We have a free supplier training program because we have so many experts. We often do 45-minute like technical webinars for specific brands or banks. And we do this to directly their supply chain or their clients. And it's a closed meeting, but we'll focus on anything super, super specific. CDP and EcoVadis are very, very popular because large groups of small companies just don't have their footing. They don't understand the algorithms and why they got a score that they did, and they need help improving those scores. And so we'll do that. We can record it if you want, and you can put it on like an intranet. And we even offer any of your suppliers or your clients who come to that like discounts on our services. And so that's a very popular service. And that's it. There's plenty of time left for questions. I want to make sure that I leave some, but if there's anything I can back up to, anything you want to know about climate or COP29 or regulations coming for greenhouse gases, this is the time to do it. Use that Q&A box to the right-hand side of the screen to type those in. Earlier, someone asked, will this be on? Yep, it looks like you probably just didn't see it, but maybe it wasn't starting as fast for somebody, or they froze up like I did. Greg said, are you able to share the sample size for these surveys we are taking? So I think, yeah, we have 29 people live, and we have, yeah, so that's who's live right now. Actually, I wasn't looking earlier. Some people might have dropped off. And then Alicia, you mentioned CSRD. That's a really great example of a driver for global sustainability regulation.
So Adam, while we wait for questions to come in, can you share maybe a couple of good ways to get started when it comes to addressing sustainability?
Yes, and I will get to your couple questions popping up. I mean, the best way is to take training. If you're not familiar and you don't know what to do next, there's a good chance that a training is going to give you a very clear sense of where to go. If you have taken training and your team knows greenhouse gas accounting and assurance standards, sometimes that training could just be taking basically at the level of verification, internal folks who want to be basically their auditor so that they can improve the chances of passing their verification on the first time. That taking a verifier course is really, really helpful, and we have a lot of clients who do that to help them pass. Oscar says, will you share the webinar attendance, the presentation webinar deck? Yes, Oscar, we will definitely, an email blast will go out with the slides later. Denise says, ISO 9001 is adding climate factors. I entered none in the survey questions. Yes, thank you, Denise, that is true. I have mixed feelings about ISO standards because it's basically kind of, there's always a continuous improvement aspect to ISO core standards, and we say core 9001, 14,000, 45,001. Bolting on climate to everything else it seems like maybe a good idea, but I think it sometimes loses the plot, if that makes sense. Of, quality in itself is important, and it should, but to sort of distract people with, hey, ISO, in my opinion, ISO 9000 and quality could just stay quality. And people should get familiar with ISO 14064-1, and I think we'd all be better for it. Maybe it'll raise awareness, but it's really hard to take the people and the individuals who are responsible for ISO 9000, which are typically quality managers. They're not prepared to address climate factors. And so that's why people who handle ISO 45001, for instance, are often health and safety professionals, and vice versa. Environmental professionals handle 14,001. So just tacking it on to like an ISO 9000, as someone who believes strongly and is working diligently to combat climate change, I have mixed feelings about that, but it is being done, and I hope it ends up with good results. Other questions, I think says, webinar. Yes. Also, Oscar, there will be a certificate, of attendance. I think it'll be with the email that just confirms that you've taken it. Some of the other things, Kim, you asked, what can you do? It's really back to those actions. Is I cannot stress enough how much verification is important. So if you've gone down that road, we have seen clients do with absolute positive intent and very, very good faith efforts, still get 7 years down the road and have miscalculated their carbon footprint, and in some significant ways. And it is difficult to go back and recalculate your baseline at that point. So don't get even 1 year down the road without doing like a pre-verification, which are very accessible, very affordable, you can do it fully remote, and then get a limited assurance. And then if you never do it again, if you have no regulatory pressure, absolutely. But I would just, encourage you as a business, for your own well-being and your own confidence, for what we've seen, pre-verification and then a limited assurance, and then you could be good, unless you do some significant overhaul of your footprint. But I cannot stress enough how difficult that is, and costly and time consuming, and sometimes just simply impossible. You can't go back 7 years. You've turned over staff, or you've switched data management systems. And so you will lose what you think is 7 years of great work. And it will just sort of go in the trash. So we really hate to see that happen. But those are my recommendations. We're at the end. I don't see other questions popping off right now, but I encourage you to reach out to us. Kim is an amazing resource. Our YouTube channel, go subscribe to it. We have so much valuable, basically consider it free information and consulting, if you will, but it's not. It's just us giving technical webinars on topics we know a ton about. You could stay there for a very long time and never watch all of it, but find your niche, and I promise you'll find something valuable.
Awesome. Well, it looks like that covers everything for today. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me directly if you've got any questions. I'm happy to loop in Adam and the technical team as needed, but we're here to help. Thanks so much, Adam, for all the wonderful information, and thank you, everybody, for your time. Have a great day.